Have you ever wondered why some people suddenly start respecting you the moment you stop trying to convince them to? Why do people ignore your value while you're constantly showing it, explaining it, proving it, and demonstrating it? Yet somehow they become fascinated by it the moment you pull back. At first glance, it doesn't make sense. You would think that the more evidence someone has of your value, the more they would appreciate it. But psychology tells us something entirely different. In fact, one of the most fascinating things about human behavior is that people often struggle to accurately assess value when it's constantly available to them. The human mind has a tendency to normalize what it experiences repeatedly. Psychologists call this habituation. And habituation is the process by which something that once stood out eventually fades into the background simply because it becomes familiar. Think about your favorite song, for instance. The first time you heard it, it might have given you chills. You played it over and over and over, but eventually those same emotional reactions begin to diminish. And it's not because the song became worse, because your brain adapted. The same thing happens with people. The same thing happens with kindness. The same thing happens with support. The same thing happens with loyalty. When someone is consistently available, supportive, and understanding, the human brain often stops consciously recognizing the effort involved. The value becomes familiar, and familiarity often creates blindness. That's why some people don't fully appreciate what they're receiving while they're receiving it. And it's not necessarily because they're malicious either. It's because they're adapted. And this is where many kind people get trapped, because they assume the solution is to explain more, to communicate more, to prove more, to demonstrate more. But the problem isn't always a lack of information. Sometimes the problem is that the information has become invisible through repetition. Now let's talk about overexplaining, because overexplaining is one of the most misunderstood behaviors in human psychology. See, most people think that overexplaining is simply being thorough. It's not. Over-explaining is often a symptom of something much deeper. A need for validation, a fear of being misunderstood, a fear of rejection, a fear of losing approval. And when someone operates from those fears, they begin trying to manage how other people perceive them. They explain their intentions. They begin explaining their decisions. They explain their boundaries. They explain their feelings. They explain their worth over and over again. But here's the irony. The more you attempt to convince people of your value, the less valuable you often appear. Now, before that upsets anybody, let's break down why. Human beings unconsciously associate confidence with certainty. See, people who are confident in their position tend to state it clearly and move on. People who are uncertain tend to repeatedly defend it. And the listener may not consciously realize it, but they feel the difference. It's the difference between this is my boundary and, well, the reason I did this was because my boundary is this and this and that. And I hope you understand. And I hope you're not angry with me. And I don't want you upset and blah, 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 blah. One communicates certainty and the other communicates a need for approval. This is why emotionally intelligent people often explain less. It's not because they're cold. It's not because they don't care. It's because they understand a powerful truth. Not everyone is entitled to an explanation, and not everyone is interested in understanding. You see, some people ask questions seeking clarity, while others ask questions seeking control. And emotionally intelligent people learn how to tell the difference. And one of the biggest shifts that happens, people mature emotionally, is they stop trying to convince everyone because they realize something. People do not always change when they receive information. People change when they experience consequences. And this brings us to another powerful psychological principle: loss aversion. You see, behavioral economists have studied this for decades. Human beings experience the pain of loss more intensely than the pleasure of gain. Think about it. Losing $20 feels worse than finding $20 feels good. Losing access to someone often feels more significant than gaining access to them ever did. This is one of the reasons people frequently overlook value while it's available and suddenly become aware of it when it's gone. It's not because the value increased. It's because the loss became visible, and loss creates awareness. The support they ignored becomes noticeable. The effort they overlooked becomes noticeable. The consistently they took for granted becomes noticeable. Reality forces awareness in a way that explanations often cannot. That's why some people only understand your value after your absence introduces them to your contribution. And here's where things become even more interesting. Many people mistake being understood for being validated. And those are two completely different things. You see, to be understood means that someone comprehends your perspective. To be validated means someone agrees with your perspective. And emotionally mature people recognize that they don't need both. They will prefer understanding, but they don't require the validation. You see, immature people often require both. They need people to understand them and agree with them. And when they don't receive agreement, they continue explaining and explaining and explaining, trying to force a conclusion that the other person may never arrive at. But emotionally intelligent people learn a different strategy, you see. They stop trying to manage perception and they start managing reality. Instead of convincing people that they're valuable, they become valuable. Instead of convincing people that they're changing, they actually change. Instead of convincing people that they're growing, they grow. Instead of convincing people that they're worthy, they live as though they already know it. And that changes everything. Because reality is incredibly persuasive, much more persuasive than words. You see, people can argue with your explanation. They can challenge your reasoning. They can dismiss your perspective, but reality doesn't debate. Reality simply exists. And eventually reality reveals what explanations never could. Let's look at relationships now. Have you ever noticed how some people don't appreciate the person that they're with until that person emotionally checks out? Not leaves, not cheats, not disappears, but emotionally checks out. Suddenly, the same person they ignored becomes interesting. The same person they overlooked becomes valuable. The same person they took for granted becomes important. Why? Because for the first time, they're experienced the possibility of loss. And loss changes perception. Psychologically speaking, human begins paying far more attention to what they might lose than what they already have. This is why people often protect things more aggressively when they're at risk of losing it. It's why some people don't appreciate good health until they become sick. It's why some people don't appreciate time until they run out of it. It's why some people don't appreciate relationships until those relationships begin slipping away. You see, the value was always there. The awareness wasn't. Now let's take that same principle and apply it to family dynamic. You see, many people spend years trying to explain themselves to family members, trying to explain their boundaries, trying to explain their healing, trying to explain why they're changing, trying to explain why they no longer tolerate certain behaviors, trying to explain why they're choosing themselves. And often those explanations go nowhere. It's not because they're wrong, but because people tend to listen through the lens of their own comfort. If your growth disrupts someone's comfort, they often resist the growth before they understand it. Think about that. If your new boundary removes access they used to have, if your healing changes the dynamic, if your self-respect requires different treatment, then your growth creates an inconvenience. And people don't always welcome inconvenience, even when it's healthy. That's why some people continue explaining themselves for years. They're hoping that understanding will create acceptance. But acceptance doesn't always come through explanation. Sometimes acceptance only comes after people realize you're serious. And reality teaches them what your words couldn't. The same thing happens in workplaces. You can spend years being the reliable employee, the one who solves problems, the one who stays late, the one who covers shifts, the one who fixes mistakes, the one who keeps everything running, and nobody says much. Nobody acknowledges it. Nobody appreciates it. Everything you do becomes normal. Then one day you leave, and suddenly everybody realizes how much you were carrying. Now everybody's overwhelmed. Now everybody's scrambling. Now everybody understands, not because you explained it either, because reality exposed it. This is why emotionally intelligent people eventually stop trying to force recognition. They understand something that most people don't. Recognition that has to be demanded isn't recognition. Appreciation that has to be forced isn't appreciation. Respect that has to be begged for isn't respect. Real recognition happens naturally. Real appreciation happens naturally. Real respect happens naturally. And if it doesn't happen naturally, explaining it repeatedly rarely creates it. Now let's talk about something much deeper. Why do some people feel the need to constantly explain themselves in the first place? Because underneath over-explaining is often anxiety. Anxiety about being misunderstood. Anxiety about rejection. Anxiety about conflict. Anxiety about losing connection. You see, many people learned early in life that approval equals safety. Maybe they grew up around criticism. Maybe they grew up around unpredictable people. Maybe they grew up needing to justify themselves. So they learned that if they could just explain things well enough, they could avoid problems. But here's the problem. That strategy might help you survive childhood. It doesn't help you survive in adulthood, though, because adulthood requires a different skill: discernment. The ability to recognize when somebody genuinely wants understanding versus when somebody simply wants access. The ability to recognize when someone is asking questions to learn versus asking questions to challenge. The ability to recognize when someone is interested in clarity versus interested in control. You see, emotionally intelligent people develop this discernment over time. And once they do, they stop wasting energy where it doesn't belong. They stop explaining every decision. They stop defending every boundary. They stop proving every point. They stop seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding them. And something fascinating happens. Their confidence increases, because confidence doesn't come from convincing people. Confidence comes from trusting yourself. The more you trust yourself, the less explanation that you require. Think about the most grounded people you've ever met, the most secure people, the most emotionally mature people. Do you notice something? They aren't running around convincing everybody of who they are. They don't need to. They know. There's a quiet certainty about them, a calmness, a steadiness. And it's not because everybody agrees with them either. It's because they stopped making agreement a requirement. And that's where freedom lives. Freedom lives in no longer needing everybody to understand. Freedom lives in no longer needing everybody to approve. Freedom lives in no longer needing everybody to validate your choices. Because the truth is, some people will never understand your growth. Some people will never understand your healing. Some people will never understand your boundaries. And some people will never understand your vision. And that's okay. Their understanding is not a prerequisite for your progress. Their approval is not a prerequisite for your success. Their validation is not a prerequisite for your worth. And the sooner you understand that, the more energy you free up. And that's energy that can be used to build, to heal, to grow, to create, to evolve, instead of constantly defending your existence. So what's the lesson in all of this? The lesson is not to become cold. The lesson is not to stop communicating. The lesson is to not stop caring. The lesson is to stop believing that your value depends on somebody else's ability to recognize it, because it doesn't. You see, a diamond remains valuable whether someone recognizes it or not. A masterpiece remains a masterpiece whether someone understands it or not. And you remain valuable whether people acknowledge it or not. You see, the strongest people eventually realize that reality is far more persuasive than explanation. So instead of arguing, they build. Instead of convincing, they grow. Instead of defending, they focus. Instead of explaining, they become. And over time, reality does what reality always does. It reveals the truth. The people who were paying attention see it. The people who weren't eventually see it too. But by then, you're no longer waiting for them to catch up. You're too busy becoming the person you always were meant to be. And that is the moment that everything changes. Because the moment you stop explaining your value is often the moment people are finally forced to face reality.